Have you ever wondered, reading Revelations chapter 13, have you ever wondered the spiritual struggle behind the great tribulation, or the central characters that played out in the great tribulation? We're going to get right into that video. We're going to get right into that. We're going to dive deep into the Bible, and we're going to find out the meanings and the spiritual tribulations right after this intro. When God gives you that peace, you will rest in his security, his protection, his comfort, his love. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the struggle behind the Great Tribulation and the main characters that played out in the Great Tribulation. We're going to hit on some topics and we're going to go through it, and we're going to be reading from Revelations chapter 12, and we're going to go all the way down. The topics that we're going to be talking about is the woman and the child. Who was the woman and the child? Also, we're going to talk about the great red dragon, Satan, which is Satan. We're also going to touch on, and we're going to identify a man-child. Who was that man-child? We're going to break that down, and we're going to identify, and we're going to show that it was Jesus. We're also going to hit a bonus point. We're also going to be talking about the spiritual struggles behind the great tribulation, and the topics that we're going to touch on, and we're going to answer, and we're going to dive deep into it. The woman flees for her life. How did she flee for her life? We're going to dive into that. We're also going to dive into the great war is fought over Israel. We're going to identify that as well. We're also going to identify the glorious victory and salvation, which was won. We're going to dive into that. And we're also going to talk about the warning to the earth is given in this section, in this book. And the last one we're going to talk about is the dragon launches an attack upon the woman. And we're going to dive deep into this. We're going to get right into this video. We're going to answer these questions, and we're going to extract why the tribulation was so powerful, what was being talked about, identify the characteristics and what they mean of the woman and the child, and how Jesus Christ played out, how Satan plays out in this whole conflict that was observed. So without further ado, open your Bibles up to Revelations chapter 12, and we're going to start at verse 1. First, I'm going to read it entirely, and then we're going to go through it all. Okay, and it reads, verse 1, and it reads, "Then I witnessed a heaven, an event of a great significance. I saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out because her labor pains and agony of giving birth. Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, with 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky, and he threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. She gave birth to a son who was to rule all nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched away from the dragon and was caught up to God, to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness where God had prepared a place to care for her for 1,260 days. Verse 7, "Then there was in heaven Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels, and the dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent, called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to the earth with all his angels. Then I heard a loud voice shouting across the heavens, 'It has come at least salvation and power, and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ, for the accuser of our brother and sister has been thrown down to earth, the one who accuses them before our God day and night. And they have defeated him by the blood of the Lamb and by their testimony. And they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who live in the heavens, rejoice. But terror will come on the earth and the sea. For the devil has come down to you in great anger, knowing that he has little time. When the dragon realized that he had been thrown down on the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Verse 14. But she was given two wings like those of the great eagle, so she could fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. There she would be carried for protected from the dragon for a time and half a time. Then the dragon tried to drown the woman with a flood of water that flowed from his mouth. But the earth helped her by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that gushed out from the mouth of the dragon. Verse 17. And the dragon was angry at the woman and declared war against the rest of her children, all who kept God's commandments and maintained their testimony for Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the shore beside the sea. That is God's holy word. So if we go back up to number verses, we're going to do 1 and 2, and we're going to see some things. We're going to break this down. So now we're going to talk about the woman and the child. The woman represents Israel, and why that is significant. She represents Israel and she represents Jesus Christ. Her descriptions. What was her descriptions? I saw a woman clothed with the sun, the moon beneath her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. So we see that in verse 1. So we know that she was clothed in that. We know that that's her description. We also see in verse 2, she was pregnant and she cried out because of her labor pains and agony of giving birth. She was actually giving birth to Jesus. We know this because this was also prophesied in Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 to 11. And let's go over there and let's read it real quick. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have had another dream. And he said, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed low before me. This time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers. But his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? He asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you? But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dream meant. So we see that Joseph actually prophesied and actually had a dream of the woman and the child, right? So let's go back over to Revelations chapter. Okay, so now back over to, we just got finished with Genesis chapter 37, verse 9 to 11. So make sure you write that in your notes. So also now we're going to go into how we know that this was, we also know that this was Jesus. Her cry, she cried for the deliverance in giving birth to the Messiah, which is Jesus Christ. That's who she was giving birth to. And that's why that was the reason for her cry. Okay, so now let's go into verse 3 to 4. This is the second character. So now we're in the characters, and this is the second character, the great red dragon, which was Satan. We can see his description. His description was, he was large red dragon. He had 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept away. His tail was really, really big, or really large, 1/3 of the stars in the sky. So we see that. We see that description. But we also see his power. What was his power? His power was just what I just highlighted. He ruled over 1/3 of the stars. 1/3 of the stars, which we already know, was the 1/3 of the stars of the fallen angels. So we know that was Satan, right? So knowing that also his description, what was his aim? His aim was to devour the child, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. He was ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. They tried to kill Jesus. Satan played an intricate part in trying to kill Satan. We know that, right? So now we move on to verses 5 that also brings up a man-child being Jesus Christ, right? She gave birth to a son who was to rule. We know that he was to rule all nations with an iron rod, right? His resurrection and ascension to be exalted. We knew that he was caught up to God and to his throne. So we knew that he was going to ascend and he was going to be resurrected, right? To be exalted. His resurrection and his ascension was to be exalted. Let's say that. His resurrection and his ascension was to be exalted. It was to be exalted. So we see that, right? But also, if we go over to, we know that there was prophecies, and it was mentioned in Psalms chapter 2, verse 9, also in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 7. And let's go over there and let's read and let's see how this was prophesied or brought out in the other books. History, we just go back into history to see how these things were prophesied or spoke about in other books back in the Old Testament. Most of the time back in the Old Testament, but sometimes it could be in the New Testament as well. So let's go over to Psalm chapter 2, verse 9. So we read, "You will break them with an iron rod and smash them like a clay pots." So we see that. Let's go over to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 7. "Before the birth pain even began, Jerusalem gives birth to a son." That's Jesus Christ. That's in verse 7. So now that we got the characters out of the way, now let's talk about the spiritual struggle behind the great tribulation. This is going to be in verses 6 to 17. Let's go right into it. So we're going to go down to Revelations chapter 12, verse 6. So we know that in verse 6 that the woman flees for her life, right? What was she trying to do? She was fleeing for her life to take place prepared for her by God, to take a place that was prepared for her by God. The woman flee for her life because she was trying to flee to a place where God had prepared for her. And we see that the woman fled into the wilderness where God had prepared a place to care for her for 1,260 days, right? And we see how long that he actually said it for, right? It was supposed to be, which is calculated up to be for 3.5 years. So we see that 1,260 is 3.5 years. So we know that, right? We know that calculation is for that. Now we go into verses 7 to 9. And what we'll see, this brings up what I talked to you about, the great war that was fought over Israel and God's people. And that will be covered in from 7 to 9. Let's look at it. So now we look at the force. So the force was Michael and his angels fought. And now we see the dragon, which is Satan, and his angels also was fought. But we also get is Satan was defeated. So we'll see that Satan was actually, that they had a battle and the dragon lost the battle. So he was defeated, right? And that we also see that Satan will be barred from heaven in the last days. So we see that here was thrown down to earth with all his angels, which will come in the last days, right? So now we're going to pick up from verses 10 to 11, and we're going to deal with the victory and salvation, which was won. And also we're dealing with the victory and salvation that was won in the end times, which was, it has come at last, salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. So now let's go on to, we're going to go to the verse 11, and we're going to see what weapons was used to overcome Satan. Well, if we look here in verse 11, we'll see that the blood of the lamb was used. Also by the believer's testimony was used. And also we see, and they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. So we see that their loyalty was also used as a weapon against Satan. So that's why people always say, hold on to your faith until the bitter end, and you will see heaven. So we must always make sure that we hold on to the bitter end. But also we go and let's look at the warning to earth, which was given in verse 12. The warning to earth is given because the devil is angered over his defeat. Now he's mad at his defeat. So we see that here. For the devil has come down to you in great anger. And we also see, because the devil has not yet been permanently destroyed, he has a little time left. So we see that he has a little time left by knowing that he has little time left. We see that there, right? So now let's hit the final verses, which is 13 to 17. We're going to cover from 13 to 17. So now we're going to go into the dragon launches an attack against the woman, and we're going to reveal that this was the severe persecution that took place. When the dragon realized that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Also, we see the startling deliverance by the wings of the powerful eagle. We see in verse 14, but she was given two wings like those of great eagles, so she could fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. There she would be cared for and protected from the dragon for time and a half times. So we see that, right? We see that she was able to for her to be able to fly to a safe place, to be delivered to a safe place, to be kept for 1.5 years. So that's what that all comes up to be, 3.5 years. Also, what we get from that, the serpent's attempt to drown the woman use every means to destroy God's people. Now that shows that he will use every means to destroy God's people. And that's what the drowning means. We see that in verse 15 right here. Then the dragon tried to drown the woman with the flood of water that flowed from his mouth. He tried everything. He will try everything and do anything to drown God's people and to bring more persecution and more suffering and more hardship. Also, what we see, the enormous help from the earth. But the earth helped her by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that gushed out from the mouth of the dragon. We see that right here in verse 16. But we also see the open attack upon remaining seeds of the believer. So we see that in verse 17. And the dragon was angry at the woman and declared war against the rest of her children. That's the believers. All who keep God's commandments. All believers who keep God's commandments. We see that there. And maintain their testimony for Jesus Christ. We are the seeds, the seed of believers. We are the remaining seeds of believers. And then verse 18, we got to read verse 18. Then the dragon took his stand on the shore beside the sea. He could not. He was defeated. And he will be defeated at the end. We must always remember to keep God's commandments, maintain our testimony of Jesus Christ, and hold on to that bitter end. I want to thank you for participating in this Bible study. God bless you and God bless your family. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or any prayer requests. Thank you.